The first thing Cal Reyes remembered after the light was the smell of his own skin. It wasn't burning, exactly. More like the smell of something very old being woken up against its will. A deep mineral reek, like wet stone scraped open. He was on his back in the rubble of Relay Station Kova, one arm thrown over his eyes. And for a moment he thought he was just another casualty. Just another body the Vreth had left smoking in their sweep through the Kessel corridor. Then he moved. Then he breathed. Then he heard the sound his hands made against the concrete. A dry, papery scrape. And he knew something had gone wrong with him in a way he didn't have words for yet. He sat up. The station was ruins. 3 of his squad, Patel, Dominguez, Yoon, were scattered across the blast floor, still uncertain. The 4th, a comms specialist named Britta Hale, was crouched behind an overturned relay bank with her rifle up. Watching the door, she glanced at him. The way her eyes moved told him everything. She'd thought he was dead, and now she wasn't sure what he was. "You need to see a mirror," she said. Later, he got to his feet. The world swam. The light coming through the blown-out roof panels was just afternoon standard. But it landed on his forearms like a low-grade current. Not pain, something more insistent than pain. Something that pulled at the underside of his thoughts. He moved into the shadow of a collapsed beam and the feeling eased. What happened? They tested the Lux weapon, the full-spectrum emitter. She kept her eyes on the door. It was a field test. We were in the blast radius. Others. She stopped. The others didn't process it the same way you did. Cal looked at his hands. They were his hands, mostly. The skin across the knuckles had a quality to it he didn't recognize. A faint scaling pattern just under the surface, like something pressing outward. He made a fist. The fingers responded. He thought about Patel, about the way Dominguez had laughed at absolutely everything. And he was still himself. Still Cal Reyes from Midland 7. Still the sergeant who'd been written up twice for insubordination, and once for saving a platoon in the outer reach without authorization. He was still that. He pressed the flat like a thumb on a wound. "Can you walk?" Britta asked. "I'm standing." "That's not what I asked." They moved out before the Vreth sweep team came back through. The Kessel corridor was a 30-kilometer stretch of bombed agricultural land between the coast and the inland refugee settlement at Morro Base. Flat, open, and, for 3 more hours, lit by a Class G sun that the Vreth had apparently dissected, was an excellent delivery mechanism for their newest horror. Cal stayed to the shadows of the broken silos and the hedgerow windbreaks. Britta didn't say anything about it. She was smart that way. They were 2 kilometers out when he felt the first full change. He'd stepped out of shadow to cross an open stretch of field. 20 meters, nothing. He'd run longer distances under live fire, and the light hit him and something inside him dropped away like a trapdoor. Not pain, not quite. A sensation of falling inward, of some deep architecture of himself rearranging under pressure. And for a terrible 3 seconds he was not fully himself, not fully anything with a name. And then he was back in shadow and he was Cal Reyes again, down on one knee, hands pressed flat against the dirt, breathing like he'd just sprinted 2 flights. Britta stood over him. "How long does it last? When I'm in the light?" "Yeah," he thought about it. "I don't know. Seconds. Maybe more if I stayed." He looked up at her. "Britta." "Did I?" "No," she said immediately. "You answered too fast. You went weird for a second. Then you came back. You didn't do anything." She held out her hand. "Come on. We're burning daylight in the worst possible way." They reached Morro Base near midnight. The settlement had gone underground 6 months ago. Not metaphorically, literally, a network of converted water cisterns and ore processing tunnels that had been the Kessel colony's industrial skeleton before the Vreth arrived. The entrance was a maintenance hatch behind a burned-out grain hauler, and the watchman was a 16-year-old kid named Sue, who almost shot them both on principle before Britta talked him down. Underground, there were 912 people. Cal knew the number because Commander Vasquez told him when she met him in the corridor outside the medical bay, arms crossed, expression doing that thing it did when she was measuring something she didn't want to say. "I know what happened," he said. "You don't need to brief me." "The Lux emitter," she said. "Vreth designation Calsora. It was designed to induce rapid cellular regression in mammalian nervous systems. Strip away her word, their word, strip us away the evolved architecture and leave the base substrate. Make us animals. Make you unable to coordinate, unable to communicate, unable to fight as a unit." She studied his forearms. "It didn't work on you quite the way they planned. It didn't finish. No. You were partially shielded by the relay bank when the emitter peaked. You got..." She paused. "You got about 30% of the beam. Enough to trigger the effect but not to complete it. Which means you're something the Vreth don't have a data model for. What am I? Vasquez looked at him for a long moment. She'd commanded 3 losing campaigns and 1 victory, which was 3 more campaigns Commanders has survived in the corridor. And her face had the particular quality of someone who had learned to look at terrible things and file them carefully, rather than throw them across the room. Right now, she said, "You're a sergeant who needs to sleep." He didn't sleep. He sat in the corner of his bunk room with his back to the wall, and the lights dialed low, and he listened to the bass around him. The sounds of 900 people trying to sleep in tunnels that smelled of old water and machine oil and fear. A kid crying somewhere in the East Passage. Someone further down singing very softly. Not a war song, just a song. The kind of a melody that didn't have combat in it, that existed purely because humans apparently could not stop making music even in holes in the ground, while something vast and indifferent tried to erase them from the surface of a planet they'd been farming for 60 years. He followed the sound. The singer was a woman named Lena Maris, who had been a lounge performer at the Kessel Colony's Civic Center before the Civic Center became rubble. She was sitting on a repurposed equipment crate in what had been a water treatment staging room. And she was singing to herself and to about 30 people who had arranged themselves on the floor around her, with a careful, grateful quietness of people who had found the one thing that still worked. She had a voice that made the tunnel sound larger. Cal stood in the doorway for a long time. She glanced at him without stopping. He sat down against the door frame and let the song do whatever songs did to people who needed them. When she finished, someone started to clap, and then they all did, and the tunnel had that brief, impossible warmth that rooms get when something true has just occurred in them. "You're the one from the relay station," Lena said. She wasn't asking, "Yes, does it hurt?" No, he thought about it. "It doesn't hurt. It's more like," he stopped. "It's hard to explain. Try anyway, like being next to a current. When I'm in sunlight, something in me wants to, I don't know, simplify." He looked at his hands. "Like something in me remembers being something else and the light tells it to go back." She considered that. "But you can fight it, so far." "That's enough," she said. "So far is all any of us have." He slept eventually. He dreamed about the relay station, and about Patel's laugh, and about the smell of his own skin in the moment after the light. He woke up before the base's artificial dawn cycle and went to find Vasquez. The intelligence they had on the Cal Sora emitter was sparse and partly corrupted, recovered from a Vreth supply drone that Britta had brought down 3 weeks earlier with what she described as a very lucky shot and a completely unlucky proximity. The emitter was stationed at what had been the colony's coastal observatory, a hilltop installation with line of sight to most of the corridor. The Vreth had reinforced it significantly. They had also, the drone's data suggested, completed the prototype, and were 6 to 8 days from deploying a full array version that would cover not just the corridor, but the entire coastal region, including the 3 other settlements that were still holding on. 6,000 people, then whatever was beyond the coast. "They're going to sweep the whole region," Cal said. Vasquez nodded. "They fire that array and everyone in the coastal zone gets 30%, or 60, or 100, depending on exposure time." She spread the drone data across the table. "We need to destroy the installation. We have 9 people who can fight. We have weapons for 12. We have no air support, no armor, and no element of surprise, because they know there's a settlement somewhere in the corridor and they have been looking for it for 4 months. What we have," Cal said, "is me." Silence in the command room. "The Vreth data model doesn't account for partial exposure," he said. "They think the weapon works, or it doesn't. They're not expecting someone who can go into the light and come back." "Cal, I know what I am in the light, Commander. I know what I become." He held up a hand to stop her. "I also know I come back, every time, seconds, maybe minutes in direct exposure, and then I'm here again." He looked at her. "That's not a liability. That's a delivery mechanism. You want to use yourself as a weapon. I want to use myself as a distraction. Get me close enough to the array, and I can place the charges manually. The Vreth will see the scan data, one biological in full regression, moving fast, moving toward the installation. They'll think the weapon is working. They'll think I'm one of their successes stumbling toward them." Britta, from the corner where she'd been very quiet, "And if you don't come back?" "Then, the charges are on a timer," he said. Nobody said anything. The artificial lights hummed. Somewhere in the base, someone's child started crying and then stopped. "I'll need the plans for the observatory structure," Cal said. "And I'll need a good route with enough open ground to make them believe it." Vasquez looked at the map for a long time. Then she looked at Cal, Then she put her finger on the map. "Here," she said. "The coastal ridge approach. Open for 800 meters. They'll see you the whole way." He spent the day before the operation in the water treatment room. Not because he'd planned to, but because Lena was there, running through old material. Songs from the colony's early days, songs from Earth before the colony, songs so old they'd outlived the context that had made them. He sat on the equipment crate and ate ration paste and listened, and she sang. And the 30 people who'd been there the night before were there again with more. And at some point, Cal realized that this was the thing. This was the specifically human thing that no weapon could map. Not the fighting, not the ingenuity, not the stubbornness, though all of that was real. But this, 900 people in a hole in the ground, and 30 of them choosing to sit in a converted water room and listen to an old song because it reminded them they were still something worth being. "What's that one?" he asked. When she paused, she told him. He didn't know it. He listened to her explain where it came from. A city, a century ago, a specific kind of summer evening. And he felt the weight of all that continuity. All those generations of people who had somehow kept passing things forward through every disaster that had tried to stop them. And he thought, we are so stubborn. We are so impossibly specifically stubborn. Not brave, not brilliant. Just pathologically unwilling to put things down. "You're going tomorrow," Lena said. "Not a question." "Yes. Come back. That's the plan." She looked at him with the particular directness of someone who has spent years performing for crowds and has learned to mean things. "I'm not talking about the operation," she said. "I mean, come back. Stay yourself. Whatever that light does to you, come back." He didn't promise. Promises in a corridor while 900 people breathed recycled air felt like counterfeits. But he nodded, which was different, and she seemed to understand the difference. They moved out before dawn in the last dark. Cal and Britta and 6 others. Sue from the entrance hatch, who had apparently decided that 16 was old enough, and 5 veterans whose names Cal had learned over 3 months of shared tunnels and shared rations, and the particular intimacy of people who eat and sleep and wait for death in the same underground space. They moved along the floor of the corridor, staying to the remaining windbreaks and the burned silos, until the sky ahead began to gray. The observatory sat on the coastal ridge like a blister, all Vreth construction materials. That semi-organic alloy they used, somewhere between metal and chitin, that caught the light wrong and threw it back at angles that made your eyes work harder than they should. Cal could see the Calsora array even from 2 kilometers out, its emitter petals folded back for the night, its targeting architecture a nest of angles pointed at the sky. They'd deploy it at dawn. They'd fire it by mid-morning. Britta's team took position in the remains of a coastal weather station 400 meters back. Their job was to keep the Vreth security units occupied if anything went wrong. Cal kept walking. The ridge approach was exactly what Vasquez had described. 800 meters of open coastal scrubland, slightly uphill, with the sun rising directly behind the observatory, and therefore directly in his face the entire way. The Vreth had designed it that way. They liked their approaches to come through the light. He felt the first edge of it at 200 meters. The change came in the way it always came. A kind of internal shift of gravity, the world tilting toward something simpler and more immediate. Color sharpened. Sound separated out into its components in a way that was not unpleasant, but was not him, or not all of him. He kept walking, he let it come. He had spent the last week learning the shape of it, learning where it ended and where he began. Learning that the boundary between Cal Reyes and whatever the light made of him was not a wall but a shoreline. Constantly moving, constantly contested, always there. He was aware distantly of the Vreth security units on the ridge noticing him. He was aware of their sensor arrays pivoting. He was aware of the data they were reading. One biological, mammalian, showing the cellular regression signature of a successful Calsora exposure, moving on instinct, moving toward the installation the way the weapons designers had probably theorized exposed organisms would, drawn to the center of the thing that was changing them. Let them think that. He moved through the light, and the light moved through him, and at 400 meters he was still Cal Reyes. At 500 meters he was still Cal Reyes. The Vreth hadn't fired, they were watching their weapon's success walk up the hill toward them. At 600 meters, a Vreth unit came down the path toward him. Security inspection. They wanted a closer look. He let them look. He let the light do what it did, let it show in his face, in his gait, in the way his hands hung. And the Vreth looked at their instruments and at him, and at their instruments again, and apparently found the data satisfying, because the unit moved aside and let him pass. At 700 meters, he was at the installation's outer perimeter. At 750, he was in the shadow of the main structure, and the light released him, and he was fully Cal Reyes, for the first time in 800 meters. With his hands working the charge housing he'd had strapped under his jacket, moving on muscle memory, thinking about Lena's voice, and about Patel's laugh, and about all the people in the tunnels who were passing songs forward through the dark. He placed the first charge. He placed the second. He moved through the installation's service corridor, where the light didn't reach, where the Vreth weren't looking, because they were watching the hillside for the next wave of their expected success stories. And he placed the third charge at the base of the array's power coupling, which the corrupted drone data had identified as the structural weak point of the whole system. And he thought about the woman who'd explained the charges to him. A small engineer named O.C., who had been very specific about placement angles, and had ended the briefing by saying, "You're going to be fine," in the tone of someone who wasn't sure but was choosing to act as if. He was on his way back out when the Vreth noticed. Not because of him, because of Sue, 400 meters back, who had apparently decided that 16 was exactly old enough to do something inadvisable, and had opened fire on the security units to create a diversion before anyone had signaled him to. Cal heard the shots and understood what they meant, and understood also that the window had just closed, and he was going to have to cross 800 meters of open hillside in direct sunlight. With the Vreth security force behind him and the timer running, he ran. The light hit him at the perimeter, and the change was immediate and total. Not the partial thing from before, not the shoreline, but the full weight of it. And for a long stretch of the 800 meters, there was something in him that was not entirely himself running on the coastal scrubland with a very specific and human destination in mind. The Vreth opened fire, he moved. He'd been shot at before, in this body and the other one, and both of them apparently had strong opinions about not being shot, and those opinions were compatible, so he moved with everything he had. He went down once, 300 meters out, and the impact of the ground was the impact that brought him back. The specific physical rudeness of gravel and his own knees. The unmistakable sensation of being embodied in a body that had limits and was currently disfering several of them simultaneously. He was Cal Reyes on the ground. He got up. He ran. Britta's team opened up on the Vreth security units from the weather station. The Vreth split their attention. Cal crossed the last 300 meters in shadow, a fold in the ground, a coastal depression, a natural feature nobody had thought to mark on the tactical map until Vasquez had found it at 2 in the morning while Cal was listening to music. And he threw himself into the weather station's cover, and Britta grabbed his jacket and said something he didn't parse, and then the charges went. The sound of the Kelsora array dying was not dramatic. A structural collapse, a power coupling failure, a sequence of secondary detonations that walked up the installation like footsteps and left it in pieces. No spectacle, just physics applied carefully to a specific problem. He lay on his back in the coastal scrubland and looked at the sky and breathed. "You came back," Britta said. "I told you the plan. Sue's okay," she said. "Stupid kid is completely okay." He laughed. It was the involuntary kind, the kind that happens when the body insists on joy because the alternative is the other thing. He lay there and laughed, and the sky above the Kessel corridor was a deep and ordinary blue. And somewhere beneath it, in the tunnels under the agricultural ruins, 912 people were waiting to find out if they were still going to be themselves tomorrow. They were, for now. For the particular and temporary now, that was all anyone ever had. They walked back to Morro Base in the dark, which was not a metaphor, which was just the practical reality of having a squad member who was better off out of direct sunlight, until the medics at the base had time to study the partial exposure and figure out whether any of it was reversible, and whether reversible was even the right word. Cal didn't mind the dark. He'd been sleeping in tunnels for 3 months. You made your peace with the spaces that kept you. Vasquez met them at the maintenance hatch with a face that was doing the same careful measuring as always, and eyes that were doing something else. "Array's down," Cal said. "I know. We picked up the detonation signatures 40 minutes ago." She looked at him. "You intact?" "Define intact, Sergeant Reyes, mostly," he said. "The same mostly as before, and probably permanently." He looked at his hands in the red emergency light of the hatch corridor. The scaling was still there under the skin. He suspected it would be. He was, as Vasquez had said, something the Vreth didn't have a data model for. He suspected that remained true. "Is that a problem?" She was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that was actually thinking, rather than performing it. "We have 3 other installations along the coast," she said finally. 2 more emitter arrays in the Vreth forward positions, and a lot of open ground between here and all of them. She looked at him. "How are you on distance running?" He understood what she was asking. He understood what he was, now, not a casualty, not a cautionary tale, not a man waiting to finish becoming something else. A specific and unrepeatable tool that a specific situation had made. The kind of thing that happened when a weapon met a human being who was too stubborn to process the information correctly. "I'm fine on distance," he said. They went inside. Somewhere in the East Passage, the kid had stopped crying. Somewhere in the converted water treatment room, Lena Marys was probably still singing, or had just stopped, or was about to start again. One of those 3, cycling through the night, passing something forward through the dark for anyone who needed it. Cal Reyes found a wall to put his back against and closed his eyes and waited for morning. He wasn't afraid of the light. He'd never been afraid of the light. He was afraid of losing himself to it, which was different, which was the only fear worth having. Not the fear of power, but the fear of what power does to the person it moves through. He'd looked at that fear from the inside now. He knew its shape. He knew the shoreline. The Vreth had built a weapon that worked by stealing what made people. Stripping the architecture, leaving the substrate. They had looked at humanity and identified what they thought was the soft part, the part that could be taken. They had found the threshold where person became animal and decided that threshold was a door. They had not considered that the person on the other side of the door might know the way back. That was the thing about humans. Not the stubbornness, not the ingenuity, not the violence. Though all of those were real and all of those were applicable, it was the knowing. It was the song in the tunnel. It was the tea party in the rubble with borrowed dolls. It was the 16-year-old at the entrance hatch who opened fire early because he'd decided waiting was worse than acting. It was the way Patel had laughed at absolutely everything, even the bad things, even the things that didn't deserve it. Because Patel had understood on some cellular level that laughter was an assertion, a declaration of continued personhood in the face of every reason to stop. Cal Reyes understood that now. He'd carried it across 800 meters of open ground with an alien sun in his face and an alien weapon trying to take him apart, and he'd brought it back. That was the operation. That was the victory, if victory was the word. He thought it probably was. He slept, and when he woke up, the base's artificial dawn cycle was cycling through its pale imitation of morning, and 912 people were having breakfast and arguments and small, defiant conversations about things that had nothing to do with war. And the world outside was still there, still lit by its particular sun, still waiting. He went to find the others. There was more to do.